The hotel maid knocked twice on the door of room 412. There was no answer. She forced the door open slightly with her master key. There was no one in the room. The bed had been slept in. An open suitcase sat on the luggage rack, the clothes inside neatly folded. There was a half-drunk glass of water on the nightstand. A faint smell of soap still hung in the bathroom. But the guest was gone. His name was Dr. Aleksandr Mikhailovich Sokolov, and he had checked into the Hotel Sacher in Vienna on October 14th, 1987. He never checked out. His body was never found. No ransom demand came. No defection was announced. He simply ceased to exist. This is the story of how Mossad made a man disappear so completely that even the KGB could find no trace of what happened to him. In the autumn of 1987, Vienna was a city caught between two worlds. The Iron Curtain stretched just 50 kilometers to the east, yet the streets were filled with Western tourists, diplomats, and businessmen. This was neutral ground, where East and West met in hotel lobbies and coffee houses, where conversations were conducted in whispers and glances, where intelligence officers from half a dozen nations operated under the guise of diplomatic immunity or academic credentials. The city had been this way since the end of the Second World War. A chessboard where games were played quietly, where pieces were moved with care, and where mistakes were measured not in scandal but in bodies that washed up in the Danube or disappeared in the forests of Lower Austria. Dr. Sokolov had come to Vienna as part of a Soviet scientific delegation attending a conference on nuclear energy and reactor safety organized by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The conference was legitimate, attended by renowned scientists from 23 countries. Sokolov was listed as a researcher from the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow, one of the Soviet Union's premier nuclear research facilities. His biography in the conference materials was brief and limited. He had a doctorate in nuclear physics, had published papers on reactor core design, and was known as an expert in thermal hydraulics. What the biography did not mention was that Sokolov had spent the last 6 years working on a project so classified that even speaking its name outside secure facilities could lead to imprisonment. He was a key part of the team developing a new generation of plutonium production reactors, facilities that would not only generate electricity but also produce weapons-grade material for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The reactors were being built in closed cities that did not appear on maps, where the entire population was constantly monitored, and travel outside the city required written permission from the KGB. Sokolov knew all the technical details and specifications of these reactors. He knew their output capacities, their vulnerabilities, and their production schedules. This information was valuable enough that Western intelligence agencies would pay fortunes for it. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Sokolov for 3 years. His name first appeared in a report prepared by a source inside the Soviet scientific establishment, a low-level administrator who photographed documents in exchange for payments deposited into a Swiss bank account. The report identified Sokolov as a key figure in the plutonium reactor program. His expertise was considered indispensable by the authorities. Mossad's analysis division studied the report and concluded that Sokolov represented a target of strategic value. If he could be persuaded to defect, the intelligence he provided could give Israel and its Western allies insights into Soviet nuclear capabilities that no satellite imagery or signal interception could match. If he could not be persuaded, eliminating him would set the program back years, force the Soviets to train a replacement, and potentially introduce errors into reactor designs that could lead to failures. Either way, Israel would be the winner. The decision to act was made in the summer of 1987, after Mossad learned that Sokolov would be attending the Vienna conference. The opportunity was rare. Soviet scientists rarely traveled abroad, and when they did, they were accompanied by KGB minders whose job was to prevent contact with Western intelligence. But conferences created complications for surveillance. Large gatherings, multiple sessions running simultaneously, evening social events. It was difficult to watch every delegate at all times. Gaps appeared, and these gaps could be exploited by people who knew what they were doing. The first approach to Sokolov was made on the second day of the conference. A woman who spoke fluent Russian started a conversation with him during a break between sessions. She introduced herself as a translator working for one of the Austrian ministries, someone hired to assist with conference logistics. The conversation was brief, polite, and completely innocent. She asked him whether he was enjoying Vienna, whether his hotel was comfortable, whether he'd visited any of the city's famous cafes. Sokolov answered pleasantly, but with the caution that all Soviet citizens exercised when talking to strangers abroad. The woman did not press. She simply smiled, wished him a pleasant stay, and walked away. The second approach came that evening at a reception held at the Hofburg Palace. Sokolov was standing alone by the window holding a glass of wine he had barely touched when a man approached and began speaking to him in Russian. The man introduced himself as an Austrian academic specializing in energy policy, someone interested in the Soviet perspective on reactor safety in light of the previous year's Chernobyl disaster. The conversation lasted approximately 15 minutes. It was professional, discussing technical matters, and gave no indication of being anything other than what it appeared to be. But at the end, the man mentioned that he would be having dinner at a small restaurant near St. Stephen's Cathedral the following evening, and that if Dr. Sokolov found himself available and interested in continuing the discussion, he would be welcome to join him. The man gave the name of the restaurant and the time, then excused himself and disappeared into the crowd. Sokolov said nothing to his KGB minder about either conversation. The first had seemed too trivial to mention, and the second, while slightly unusual, could be explained as professional networking. In his hotel room, he thought about the invitation. He knew what it might represent. He was not naive. Soviet scientists received briefings before traveling abroad, were warned about the techniques Western intelligence used to make contact. The friendly stranger, the casual invitation, the appeal to professional vanity. He should report it. He should tell his minder and let the matter be handled. But he did not. The following evening, Sokolov told his minder he was tired and would be dining in his hotel room. Instead, he left the Hotel Sacher through a side entrance and walked the narrow streets of the Innere Stadt until he found the restaurant. The Austrian academic was waiting at a corner table. He stood and shook Sokolov's hand firmly, as if greeting an old friend. They ordered food, and for the first hour they talked about trivial things. Then when dessert arrived, the man leaned forward and spoke quietly. He said he was not an academic. He said he represented people who could offer Dr. Sokolov something the Soviet Union would never give him: freedom, security. A new life in a country where his skills would be valued and his work would not be used to build weapons threatening millions of lives. The man asked Sokolov not to answer immediately. He only needed to think. If he wanted to hear more, he should return to the same restaurant 2 nights later. Sokolov did not return 2 nights later, but he did return 4 nights later, on the evening of October 20th. This time the conversation was different. A woman joined the man, the same woman who had spoken to Sokolov during the coffee break. They did not waste time with pretense. They introduced themselves to him, Israeli intelligence. They explained their requests one by one: information about the plutonium reactors, the production schedules, the technical vulnerabilities. They stated what they could offer in return: a new identity, relocation to a country of his choosing, financial support, and protection for the rest of his life. Sokolov listened without interrupting. When they finished, he asked a single question. "What if I refuse?" The woman answered. "Then you go home and nothing changes. We will not threaten you. We will not expose you. You simply return to your life." But the man added something else. He said that people like Sokolov, people with knowledge that could change the balance of power, did not remain safe forever. The KGB was paranoid. They looked for traitors everywhere, and they found them even when they did not exist. A misplaced document, a colleague's denunciation, a mistake in a report. Any of these could lead to interrogation, and once that began, innocence was no defense. The man leaned back and said the offer was not just about defection. It was about survival. Sokolov asked for time to think. They agreed. He left the restaurant and walked back to his hotel. The next morning he attended the final day of the conference. He shook hands with colleagues, distributed business cards, and exchanged ideas about a future that could never happen. That evening he returned to the restaurant. He told them he would do it. He would defect. The plan was simple, but in such operations, simplicity did not mean ease. Sokolov could not simply walk away from his hotel and disappear. The KGB minder assigned to him was trained to notice deviations from routine, and any unexplained absence would immediately trigger an alarm. The Soviet delegation was scheduled to depart Vienna on October 23rd, flying back to Moscow on an Aeroflot charter. If Sokolov was going to leave, it had to be before that flight, and it had to happen in a way that gave his minders no warning. The Mossad team devised a method based on misdirection and timing. On the evening of October 22nd, Sokolov would tell his minder that he was not feeling well and would be staying in his room. He would order room service, and when the meal arrived, he would complain of worsening symptoms: nausea, dizziness, chest pain. In this situation, the minder would call a doctor, and when the doctor arrived, Sokolov would be taken to a hospital for observation. But the doctor would not be Austrian. He would be an Israeli operative with medical credentials convincing enough to pass a cursory inspection. The ambulance would not go to a hospital. It would go to a safe house outside Vienna, where Sokolov would be debriefed, documented, and prepared for extraction to Israel. The minder would be told that Sokolov was being held overnight for tests, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, Sokolov would be out of Austria. That was the plan. But on the afternoon of October 22nd, something changed. Sokolov sent a message to the Mossad contact. He said he could not go through with it. He did not explain why. He said he had made a mistake, that he was sorry about it, and that he would be returning to Moscow as scheduled. The Mossad team faced a decision. They could let him go. It was his choice, and forcing him would violate the protocols that governed how defections were handled. Or they could assume that something had happened, that Sokolov was in danger or had been threatened, and that his message was sent under duress. The team leader contacted Tel Aviv. The response came 2 hours later. Permission had not been granted for Sokolov to return to Moscow. If he had changed his mind voluntarily, the knowledge he possessed was too dangerous and important to leave in Soviet hands. If he had been compromised, his return would mean interrogation, torture, and ultimately execution. Either way, allowing him to board that flight was not an option. The order was clear. Bring him out, willing or not. And if you cannot do that, prevent him from reaching Moscow. The operation was moved up by 12 hours. On the evening of October 21st, 4 Mossad operatives entered the Hotel Sacher, through different entrances. Two posed as guests, checking in with false passports and taking rooms on the same floor where Sokolov's room was located. One entered as a maintenance worker, wearing coveralls identifying him as employed by the hotel's engineering contractor and carrying a toolbox. The fourth waited in a van parked 2 blocks away, monitoring police radio frequencies and ready to move if extraction became necessary. At 9:47 p.m., Sokolov left his room and walked toward the elevator. The KGB minder was not with him. Surveillance indicated that the minder was in his own room, 3 doors down from Sokolov's, likely filing reports or preparing for the next day's flight. Sokolov took the elevator down to the lobby and exited through the main entrance onto Philharmonikerstrasse. He turned left and began walking toward the Ringstrasse. The 2 operatives posing as guests followed at a distance. The maintenance worker exited through a service door and circled around to approach from the opposite direction. Sokolov walked for 6 blocks. He did not appear to be meeting anyone. He simply walked, hands in his coat pockets, head down, moving through the evening crowds without purpose or destination. At Kärntnerstrasse, he stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee, and sat alone at a table near the window. The operatives took positions where they could observe without being obvious. One sat inside the cafe, 3 tables away. The other stood across the street, pretending to study a shop window. For 20 minutes, Sokolov did nothing. He drank his coffee slowly, sitting and watching the people passing by the window. Then he paid, stood up, and walked out. He continued down Kärntnerstrasse toward the Stephansplatz, and as he approached the square, one of the operatives noticed something. A man in a dark coat had been following Sokolov since he left the cafe. The man maintained a consistent distance, matched Sokolov's pace, stopped when Sokolov stopped. He was not trying to hide. He was letting Sokolov know he was there. KGB. The realization forced an immediate decision. If the KGB was actively shadowing Sokolov, it meant they suspected something. Perhaps they had intercepted communications. Perhaps someone had reported the meeting at the restaurant. Perhaps Sokolov himself had confessed under pressure. Whatever the reason, the operation was no longer a quiet extraction. It was a race. The team leader made the decision. They would take Sokolov now in the open, before the KGB shadow could call for reinforcements. The maintenance worker moved first. He approached Sokolov from the side, matched his stride, and spoke quietly in Russian. He told him not to react, not to look at him, and to keep walking. He said the man following him was KGB, and that if Sokolov did not come with him, he might not live to see Moscow. Fear was evident on Sokolov's face, but he kept walking. The operative guided him into a side street off the Stephansplatz, a narrow alley that ran between 2 buildings. The KGB shadow followed. The second operative intercepted him at the entrance to the alley. There was no fight, no dramatic confrontation. The operative stepped in front of the man and said something in German. The KGB agent hesitated, reached for something inside his coat, and then the operative struck him once in the throat with the edge of his hand. The man collapsed, gasping, unable to call for help. The operative dragged him into a recessed doorway, out of sight. By the time the man recovered enough to breathe comfortably, Sokolov and the Mossad team were gone. The van was waiting at the end of the alley. Sokolov was pushed inside and the doors closed. The driver pulled into traffic and headed away from the city center, west, toward the safe house in the 13th district. Inside the van, Sokolov sat in silence, staring at his hands. One of the operatives asked him why he had tried to back out. Sokolov did not answer. The operative asked again. Still nothing. Only a few minutes had passed when Sokolov spoke. He said his minder had told him that his wife in Moscow had been hospitalized. A sudden illness, nothing serious, but the doctors wanted to keep her under observation. The minder had been understanding, had offered to arrange an early flight if Sokolov wanted. It had seemed like kindness, but Sokolov realized too late that it was a test. If he had accepted the offer, it would confirm that he cared more about his wife than his duty, and that would be enough to trigger an investigation. If he refused, it would suggest that something else was occupying his attention. Either way, the KGB was watching. Sokolov said he was scared. He thought that if he called off the defection, if he returned to Moscow quietly, maybe they would leave him alone. Maybe they did not know about the meetings. Maybe he could survive. The operative told him he was wrong. If the KGB suspected him, returning to Moscow meant death. Sokolov nodded slowly. He said he understood that now. He asked what would happen to his wife. The operative did not answer. The safe house was a 2-story building in an ordinary neighborhood. The van pulled into the garage and the door closed behind them. Sokolov was brought inside, given food and water, and left alone in a room on the 2nd floor. The team leader contacted Tel Aviv again. The situation had changed. The KGB knew something was wrong. They would search for Sokolov, and when they did not find him, they would notify Austrian authorities that a Soviet citizen had been abducted. Austria, despite being neutral, maintained relations with Moscow, and the Soviets would apply pressure. Diplomatic channels would be activated. The police would investigate, and if Sokolov was found in an Israeli safe house, it would create an international incident that could damage relationships Israel depended on. The order from Tel Aviv was clear. Sokolov could not be taken to Israel through normal channels. The airports would be watched. The borders would be monitored. Any attempt to move him openly would result in interception. He had to disappear completely, and the only way to ensure that was to remove any trace that he had been in Mossad custody. The team leader knew what this meant. There would be no defection. There would be no debriefing. Sokolov would not be given a new identity or relocated to safety. He would simply cease to exist. The team leader requested confirmation. The response came within minutes. Confirmed. The operation entered its final phase just after midnight. Sokolov was told that arrangements were being made for his travel, that he would be leaving Austria within hours, and that he needed to rest. He seemed relieved. He asked if he could write a letter to his wife, to be delivered after he was safe. The team leader said yes. Sokolov spent an hour writing, filling 3 pages with small, careful handwriting. When he finished, he folded the letter and gave it to the operative. Then he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. The operatives moved quietly. One prepared a syringe containing a sedative strong enough to ensure that Sokolov would not wake during transport. Another prepared an ordinary sedan with Austrian plates for the journey that would take Sokolov out of Vienna. The third contacted a disposal team that specialized in such problems. The team leader read the letter Sokolov had written. It was addressed to his wife, explaining that he had been approached by foreign agents, that he had agreed to help them, and that he was sorry for the pain this would cause her. He wrote that he loved her and would always love her, and that she must never forget this. He wrote that he had no idea where he would be going, but that he would try to send word when it was safe. The letter ended with a line that the team leader read twice. I wanted to believe there was a place where I could be free. I was wrong, there's no such place for people like me. The team leader burned the letter in the kitchen sink. Then he went upstairs and administered the sedative. Sokolov did not wake. He was carried to the sedan, placed in the trunk, and driven out of Vienna. The location chosen for disposal was near the Hungarian border, a sparsely populated region that was rarely patrolled. The sedan arrived just before dawn. 2 members of the disposal team were waiting. They worked efficiently, without conversation. Sokolov's body was removed from the trunk and placed in a pre-dug grave, deep enough that animals would not disturb it and remote enough that hikers were unlikely to stumble upon it. The grave was filled, the surface covered with leaves and branches, and within an hour there was no indication that the ground had been disturbed. The team returned to Vienna separately. The sedan was cleaned and returned to the rental agency from which it had been obtained under a false name, and the safe house was sanitized. Every surface was wiped, every trace of Sokolov's presence, everything, every sign was erased. By the time the sun rose on the morning of October 23rd, it was as if he had never been there. The Soviet delegation departed Vienna that morning as scheduled. The KGB minder reported that Dr. Sokolov was missing. Austrian police were notified and a search began. Hotels, hospitals, and morgues were checked. Sokolov's photograph was distributed to border crossings and transportation hubs. Interpol was contacted. The Soviet embassy in Vienna issued formal protests, demanding that Austrian authorities find their missing citizen and investigate the possibility of abduction by Western intelligence. The investigation lasted 3 months. No witnesses came forward. No evidence of foul play was found. Sokolov's hotel room was empty, his belongings left behind, but there was no sign of forced entry or any disturbance inside. Security cameras at the hotel showed him leaving on the evening of October 21st, but after that, nothing. He had walked into the streets of Vienna and vanished. The Austrian government eventually concluded that Sokolov had either defected voluntarily or met with an accident, and that without a body or witnesses, further investigation was pointless. The case was closed. The Soviet Union conducted its own investigation. The KGB interrogated everyone who had been in contact with Sokolov in Vienna. They reviewed his travel records, his communications, his financial transactions. They found nothing. The minder who had been assigned to watch him was recalled to Moscow and subjected to months of questioning. He was eventually cleared of complicity but never worked in a foreign posting again. Sokolov's wife was questioned repeatedly. She insisted she knew nothing, that her husband had never expressed dissatisfaction with his work or his life, and that she could not imagine why he would defect. She was never charged with any crime, but her life in Moscow became a form of imprisonment. She was denied travel, denied promotions, and constantly watched by neighbors who reported her movements to the KGB. She died in 1995, her husband's fate still unknown. Mossad never acknowledged involvement in Sokolov's disappearance. The operation was classified at the highest levels, and the operatives who conducted it were reassigned to other duties. The team leader retired from active service in 1991 and died of cancer in 2003. He never spoke publicly about his work, and his family did not learn the details until years after his death, when portions of Mossad's archives were selectively declassified. Even then, Sokolov's name was redacted from the files. The story survived as rumor, whispered among intelligence professionals who pieced together fragments from defectors, leaks, and occasional careless remarks. In 2007, a former Mossad officer published a memoir in which he mentioned an operation in Vienna in the late 1980s involving a Soviet scientist who had been removed from play. He provided no names, no dates, and no details, but those familiar with the case recognized the reference. The forest where Sokolov was buried remains undisturbed. There's no marker indicating his presence there. The trees have grown, the seasons have passed, and the ground has settled, If someone were to stand at that spot today, they would see nothing unusual. Just earth and leaves and the silence of a place where nothing happens. The plutonium reactor program that Sokolov had worked on continued without him. The Soviets trained a replacement and the reactors were completed on schedule. The intelligence that Israel had hoped to gain from his defection was never obtained. The operation, measured by its original objectives, was a failure, but measured by the standard that governed such work, it was a success. The problem had been identified, the risk had been assessed, and the solution had been executed without exposure or consequence. Sokolov had been eliminated, and no one could prove that Mossad had been involved. That is the metric by which such operations are judged. Not by what was gained, but by what was prevented. Not by the evidence left behind, but by the absence of evidence. Not by the stories that are told, but by the silence that remains. Dr. Aleksandr Mikhailovich Sokolov checked into a hotel in Vienna on October 14, 1987. He was 43 years old, a respected physicist, a husband, and a man who for a brief moment believed that escape was possible. He was wrong. The world he lived in did not permit escape. It only permitted choices, and every choice led to the same end. Some roads were simply longer than others. His ended in a forest near the Hungarian border, in a nameless grave, in a silence that has lasted nearly 4 decades. And those who put him there have never said a word.